Hi, and welcome to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host. Remember to hit the subscribe button for plenty more interesting conversations to come. Today, we're going to get into a fascinating conversation that frankly, everybody has dealt with. And that is what happened when COVID happened and your workplace, just everybody went home, but you still had to do work. So you still had to find a way to engage with your coworkers and with your community and with your constituents and with anybody else you wanted to interact with. That's the topic we're going to get into today with two excellent people. I'm really excited that we've got them on the show. One is, the first I'm going to introduce is Emily Torres-Cullinane, who is at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. We've had a couple of people from MAPC on the show, partly because the excellent work that everybody there does. Emily is the co-director of strategic initiatives at MAPC. Emily, welcome to Unplanned.
Thank you for having me.
And we're also joined by her colleague, Carolina Prieto, who is the community engagement manager at MAPC. Carolina, welcome to Unplanned.
Thanks so much, Sam. Excited to be here.
Yeah, well, we're thrilled you're here. And Emily, why don't we start with you? Why don't we just kind of dive right into the topics that we were talking about as we were getting ready for the show, which is basically COVID happened right about a year ago now. And you who engage with the community as a planning organization, you had so many issues you had to address. Why don't you take us back to that moment 1 year ago and everything you were thinking about in those first crazy and frankly awful days of COVID?
Well, Sam, a year ago, I think myself and our whole team were thinking, we are community engagement folks. Our sort of skills lie in talking to people, gathering people, face-to-face communication and engagement. And, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? Can we do this? And right away, the team just pivoted. I think that's like the word of the year. And thought, you know what, at the core of what we do is we find ways for municipalities and the community to connect with each other. And for years, we had actually been thinking about how do we use digital tools better? How do we sort of lean into virtual engagement? And in a way, we actually didn't have to. There was nothing really pushing us there. And so we just put our heads together. We got really creative and we tried things that worked. And then we tried things that didn't work. And we just learned every day. And let's get Carolina into the conversation right now, and then we'll go back to you. Carolina, what was your experience like a year ago today? I mean, how did you think about those first days when everybody had to go work from home and communicate with the constituents and with each other? What was your experience?
Well, I think there was an immediate need to respond to community members and our planning partners, right? So we're on many projects. I was actually at the crux of working on a master plan, and our first in-person community forum was supposed to happen that first week of April. And so we were really scrambling to get us to a digital platform that would make sense. So there was a lot of research that went into looking onto online platforms. We didn't really know that Zoom was where we were going to land. And so there was a lot of, all hands on deck effort to really research those, and talk to our partners, research the platforms, but also partner with everybody so that we could quickly onboard our staff, but also our project partners to the work that was ahead.
Well, and let's bounce it back to Emily. Take us into those first days of actually going into these platforms and trying to understand how that would work. I think you made the point that, people have been thinking about this for a long time. People are working from home more. There's a lot of that already in the air. And then all of a sudden, coronavirus comes and we all have to make that jump immediately. How did you go about it? What did you do?
Right. So with the team, we immediately just kind of listed the different tools. We did some research. We tried to figure out, okay, what can we use? And we tested it. Actually, I want to give credit to Carolina. She would have us literally sit on Zoom and go through the settings and like, okay, what does this setting do? And we would click on all the buttons and we would just try to figure out, this is what we would do in person and how can we translate that virtually. So we just did a lot of playing and testing, and people were very patient. And we also did a lot of using our colleagues as guinea pigs.
Carolina, how was it? So you were in the middle of a master planning process
Yeah.
at the time, right?
Yeah, so I think a couple things. Our team actually started with webinars. So we started actually trying to onboard internally and externally in terms of, yes, the technical side of it, which is really important. And, Zoom and other platforms have a way to onboard you that quickly, right? They constantly update their settings. They're constantly updating their help desk. And so that's a really great resource. But where our expertise actually comes in is actually helping to understand the facilitation, the human connection, and the needs to really communicate a back and forth feedback loop, right? That is key to our planning process. And so that's what we were really trying to facilitate in the first few months is really, how do you translate the work that we do in person in terms of connection, community cohesion, and feedback into an online platform?
I mean, we're now all in the virtual world. We're all communicating by Zoom. There's this big question about what happens once everybody gets vaccinated. Does the workplace reestablish itself, or do we continue in this kind of Zoom light world? What's your takeaway now that we have a whole year to reflect on it?
Well, I was talking to someone about this last week, and they had said something really interesting that really resonated, which is we're not the same people we were a year ago. I think we now maybe think a little differently. We've had that experience of having to grow, that learning curve of using all of these virtual tools. I think Zoom now feels very normal. And so, I'm thinking about, well, what does the next year look like? And I think we're almost where we were last year, where it's like, okay, we actually don't know what the next year looks like. And we're going to have to reinvent ourselves one more time. Because when we get back together again, we're not going to just go back to the way we did community engagement before. We're going to take the tools and the ways that Carolina was talking about, that we established how to communicate and how to have better accessibility between the municipalities and community members. We're going to take those tools and those skills that we learned, we're going to use them. So it's going to be another year, I think, another year of figuring it out.
Zoom and all these interfaces are screen based, and in that sense they're kind of passive interfaces. We spend a lot of time looking at screens. It's yet another screen in our lives, and you can sort of my joke is you can sort of sit in the back of the classroom. You don't have to sit in the front of the room and answer every question. You can just participate by watching. The flip side of the Zoom world is, whereas you might have a community meeting that would gather maybe 15 regulars who always show up at the community meeting, you can hold a Zoom meeting and get a couple of hundred people show up, because the mom who's busy with other stuff can have it on her screen while she's doing something in the kitchen or with a baby, or the dad who is busy with something else can be watching it on his iPhone or whatever it is. What's been your take on all of that? That's been my sense of it, but what's your sense on all that?
Yeah, no, actually, accessibility has been the number one benefit, I would say, from the virtual engagement. I don't know, like even last night, I jumped on a call, I was putting my kids to bed. I got my phone, I put my phone on, and I was able to watch and kind of listen in onto my town is having a presentation on climate. And I was able to kind of listen in and still be connected and still get the information that it is that I wanted, and still sort of ask a question in real time and also do the house responsibilities. I mean, that's on like the mother side of things. But I mean, if you think about it too, there was people this past year that we have never seen at public meetings. people who don't have 9-to-5 jobs, people who transportation is not easy, access to transportation to get to a public meeting at a certain time, at a certain date. People were able to kind of pop in and pop out. And it was kind of okay to have people in the back of the room, like you're saying, because even if people sort of didn't put their camera on or even make a comment, they were still sort of listening, taking in information that maybe they had never been privy to before. Something Carolina and I and the rest of our community engagement team talk about is building stronger civic infrastructure. And I guess I don't have a perfect definition for it, but it's, how a community is connected, how it communicates, the trust that's there, where people feel like they can either reach out to each other, lean on each other. And that's something that we're always working towards. When we work in a new place, what does the civic infrastructure look like? And how can we as community engagement specialists improve it in order to then improve whatever it is that, is happening in that city or in that town?
That's a fascinating. I like that phrasing of it too. That's a wonderful way to think about it, because infrastructure, we always think about things in concrete and steel, but of course there is that human infrastructure that either exists and works, or sort of exists and sort of works, or doesn't exist, doesn't work at all. Fascinating. Carolina, let me bounce this over to you, and it's something that Emily touched on. And let's see if we can get into it a little bit more. And that's the question of, let's call it the social justice part of the online world. So people who are very plugged in are literally very plugged in, but there's a whole part of our communities that have very limited or low or no capacity to participate online. It gets to the question of the digital divide, which is a related topic to what we're talking about here. Carolina, can you give us some of your thoughts or observations as you've been doing your work in the field on those questions?
Yeah, I think of the digital divide as something that we're going to have to really tackle head on moving forward. It's something that a lot of people have been working on for many, many years. It's not something necessarily new, but I think it's been enhanced through this year. And I'm really excited because we're recently been working on a digital access plan with multiple communities, Everett, Revere, and Chelsea, and really working with those folks to come together and think about what does not only the digital literacy piece, which is very important and key part of this, but also the actual structural infrastructure going into communities and what inequities we see between those communities in terms of internet access, and also in terms of not just the access itself, but also the types of resources and tools that are provided to community members on an ongoing basis.
Well, can I jump in here and just ask you, do you have any preliminary feedback? I know a lot of people have thought about this question, and it's only been heightened with COVID, where the absolute necessity, it's no longer a luxury of any definition. It's key core infrastructure, to use that word again. Do you have any preliminary feedback on what's been found out there in terms of who has access now, what kinds of investments or changes need to be made to improve that and to level the playing field in terms of access?
Well, I think we're still in the process of finding that out, especially through this project. But I do think that first and foremost, people need to understand that there is a structural difference, unfortunately, that we see between communities. And we're trying to figure out what that looks like. But if you can guess that, the way that you get internet is not just what kind of, plan you have with your provider, but it's really a larger infrastructure issue. I mean, that learning, I think in and of itself is a really important tool for advocates, for planners, and for community members to understand, so we can advocate appropriately for the policy changes we need to see. So I think that's the first kind of start, and then we can move on and build from there, which I think is an important understanding.
Are you just on that? I just want to pull that thread just a second longer. Does that mean approaching the providers themselves, the Verizons, the Comcast, the other people who are out there in the field actually providing this stuff? Is that part of what you're talking about when you talk about that, or is it something else?
I think that's part of it. I think part of it is thinking about creating partnerships, seeing what kind of data we can gather so that we can analyze appropriately what's going on at the community level, at the track level, at the street level, and what differences we have. Also, there's, I think, a cultural piece to it as well, right? And if you think about why people have like a dish service, for example, and you want to see your novelas or something like that on Dish TV or whatever it might be, there's also a cultural component that plays into it that I think is needing to be considered. And then, like you were saying, Sam, it's not just a would like to have. This is a core necessity for work, for healthcare. In terms of telehealth, we're seeing so much more use of that, and so that's going to be a key infrastructure piece for us. And in terms of schooling, we've all seen that kind of grow and be enhanced. And that's a question that I continue to have: is what's that going to look like in the future for us, and how do we support our communities with that work?
Emily, I want to go back to you now. So you were saying, so we got through 1 year, and you said we kind of have to rethink what this next year is going to look like. Why don't you take us into that a little bit? What did you mean when you said that? When you say that?
Sure. So certainly I'm a people person, and I can't wait to actually get into a room with my colleagues and connect with people again and not have to be looking at the screen in my house. And I also think that there is a broad sort of reach that we were able to have this year by having virtual engagement. I don't want to lose it. And so some of the things that I've been thinking about are, what does a public meeting look like in the next coming months when it's safe to get back together? Having people come back in person, certainly. I think that's really important. I think you don't take that away, but I also don't think you close the door to having other people be able to access a public meeting. And so our challenge now is like, how do we create the space so that it feels natural to be having a conversation, and also sort of a camera or a public presence that's not physically there? How do you still are able to have the public, if they choose to come in virtually, how can they still participate? And so that's just going to be the challenge. And there's lots of other things here. Sam, do you want me to get into a couple more that I'm thinking about?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to, a thought was crossing my mind as you go into those of, I'm sure one of the challenges you faced was not just working within MAPC and your capacity to kind of adapt and adopt the online world, but also some of these cities, and particularly the towns, they might have one urban planner who is not particularly internet savvy or tech literate or whatever. Working with them to get set up and working in this new environment must have been a real challenge. But why don't you keep going on your thoughts that you were just about to start in on?
So first of all, I have to do a shout out to all of the planners in our region. They were amazing at trying to, again, just come up with new and ways to keep the work going, and had to, in some ways, just learn as they went and pull in people. So I saw a lot of communities that either had a small planning office kind of pull in volunteers to be able to have someone helping with tech, someone sort of taking notes, someone helping, mute, unmute, like whatever it is, and still run their public meetings. So a huge shout out to all of the planners in Metro Boston. And I know that I've heard some planners say, you know what, it was really exciting to have more, I'd see the numbers at the bottom of the screen and it would go up and up and up. And it was, exciting. Okay, like people are plugging in. How do I keep this going next year? Again, I'm just either one or two people. How am I going to have the capacity to continue this? And so one of the thoughts I've been throwing around my head is a lot of towns certainly rely on volunteer committees. And how great would it be if we had like a digital community engagement committee or something, or some civic committee that is folks that might be interested in maybe stepping in and helping municipal staff either run an online chat while the meeting is happening, or help record and edit, or help get the word out on public meetings and have more people attend. Or even, I think Carolina was talking about the digital divide. How can maybe community members come together and orient people who are less tech savvy on how to even use these tools?
I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you both were at South by Southwest just recently. Why don't you tell us why don't each of you tell us why were you there and what did you learn from there? And Carolina, why don't you go first? Why don't you start out? Tell us.
Thanks, Sam. So I think the reason why I wanted to go to South by Southwest is just to sort of amplify and widen the breadth and the work that I've been doing, and kind of think about it in different angles.
Well,
so,
why there? What was it about there that why go there of all places?
Well, if you know, South by Southwest has a huge emphasis on technology, the innovation of technology, and also it does have some information around, government access, interventions, and also some planning work and landscape architecture and other topics. So it is quite a comprehensive and diverse conference. And so really wanted to dive into sort of what was going on, what are people talking about, and how can we bring that and think about how to creatively interact with that on the planning side. And so I think for me, some of the interesting things was, the conversations around artificial intelligence. I think particularly for me, the ethics around that is very interesting. And then as we see some of those things come into play, what does that mean for something like community engagement, and how will those kind of tools evolve over time, and how can we get creative about that evolution for our planning work? And so, I think it was quite evident that there were a lot of conversations back and forth, I will say, about how AI is going to evolve, how we can use it, how it's already being used in healthcare sector, government, and other sectors, and what does that mean for our work? And so that's a question that I want to bring back to our team to think about. And I think additionally the future of work, right? Because I think that's going to really affect not only the economy on a national and global scale, but on a local scale.
Emily, how about yourself? What was your experience of going down there, and what do you think you took away from the whole experience?
Well, I was really focused on finding out how the entertainment world was going to do hybrid, and what we could steal, what kind of ideas we could glean. And
by hybrid, you mean what exactly? What is hybrid mean?
How to have people have experiences, whether they're in person and then adding in virtual. So having experiences where people are also in that same kind of space, but virtually. So I know the entertainment world is trying to reinvent themselves as well. Live music is going to be thinking about that. And the other thing I wanted to think about was the future of government, the future of technology, where technology and civics meet. And then on the marketing side of things, how important storytelling, and I know we've been saying this for like many years, but how even more important storytelling is, how important it is to have branding. So for a municipality.
In what sense? For what though? Branding for what? Storytelling about what?
Sure, like, if you're doing a zoning project in your town, and it's not enough to put out an invitation to a zoning meeting, like what's the story here? How do you sort of capture people's interest? How do you sort of dig in a little deeper? I just want to add, like, some of the things that we think about when we do community engagement is that sometimes we feel like we're community therapists. We're always asking what are your goals? What do you care about? Like, what are your strengths? Like, what are your fears? And so it's kind of interesting. And so how do you still do that with all the things that are going on, I think is something to think about. And at MAPC, our community engagement team, we're about to launch a newsletter. We would like to get all the pearls of wisdom that we've gained this year and start putting them in a place and building that network of folks. So Carolina, our community engagement manager, is really leading that effort. She's been blogging, writing some posts about some of the things that we've been thinking about and learning over the past year. We really hope to be leaning into that more and more this year.
Well, that's very exciting. Why don't you give us a website where people can go just to find these various online tools that you guys have?
Yep, so you can just click on mapc.org and click on our community engagement link, and it will give you all the resources that we have, toolkits, and information about what we can offer.
Great. Well, with that, I want to thank you both for joining us on Unplanned. Absolutely fascinating. And I think we've just scratched the surface. I think we just opened up this conversation, because I'll be fascinated to hear about what you decide are important over this upcoming year. As you've said, that we've been through quite a year, but we've still got a lot of questions out there, and the world is changing ever faster as we move along. Emily Torres-Cullinane, Carolina Prieto, thank you both.